Hey everybody, Void Forever here. Today I wanted to show you guys the basic components that go into building your own machine. As you see out here laid in front of you, we have a power supply, we've got the CPU, some RAM, the motherboard, the video card, there's a CD-ROM over here, and then two different types of hard drives. And I know it all looks a little intimidating, but my hope with this video is that I want to show you guys exactly how easy it is for all of this stuff to be put together into its own machine. I've had a lot of questions from the community recently about how to put together a machine or, the different parts that go into it. So I figured, a very high-level overview, no troubleshooting, but a very high-level overview of everything that goes into a computer might be a useful video for you guys. So I'm going to scoot all this stuff out of the way and I'm going to bring each individual piece on and show you guys how it all fits together. Okay guys, so the first parts that I wanted to show you were the hard drives. And I've got two different types of hard drives here in front of me. These are arguably the easiest pieces to install or upgrade because they pretty much just slide in and out of the case and they've only got two connections to them. And the nice thing is if you're upgrading a hard drive and you're not adding a hard drive, you can already use an existing cable from an old hard drive without adding an additional one. Adding an additional cable is not difficult, but it's kind of a convenience if you don't have to fish around and rewire the system. So this right here is just a standard, regular run-of-the-mill hard drive. This is the spin disk hard drives. These are much slower than their SSD counterparts. This is what you're going to use. If you don't have the money for an SSD, this will be your main hard drive, but these are great for storage. They cost very little. You can get 2, 3, even 4 terabytes for sometimes under $150 depending on how big you want to go. On the end of it here, and unfortunately my camera's not the greatest, but it will hopefully yeah, it's working a little bit here. You'll see that we have two connections. These are the two connections that I was talking about. The smaller of the connections is where the hard drive connects to the motherboard with an SATA cable, which is that cable I have laying here. The larger connection is the power connection. It's difficult to see on the video, and I do apologize about that, but it is impossible to plug these in wrong. There are little notches that come up on these connections, and they match up with notches that are on the cable. So you literally cannot plug this in wrong. And it's as simple as finding the notch on the cable, lining it up, and then just plugging it in. And this one has a snap on it, so you might hear it. And that's it. It's connected. At that point, you'll connect it to the motherboard, which I have over here, and I will show that later. The power connection is exactly the same, and I have one here, kind of, in this jumble of cables here. But it's a little bit larger, but again, it has the same notch, and again, it just plugs right in, and that's it, and you're done. Slide the hard drive into the machine and boot the computer up and do what you need to in Windows. I won't go into that because again, that's kind of a more advanced view, but I just wanted to show you guys the two different hard drives, what they look like. This is an SSD. It is tiny, very small, but it has the exact same connections. The smaller one, which is the one that connects to the motherboard, and the larger one, which is power. Now to go along with those, move them off to the side here, is the CD-ROM. Do people still use CD-ROMs? There's a lot of pre-built computers now that don't even come with them, even laptops. Everyone's moving over to using USB as a storage medium, but it's still nice to have one of these, either a DVD-ROM or Blu-ray. It's got the exact same connections on the back. They are the exact same as a hard drive, so again, the larger connection and the smaller connection, and it just connects up to your motherboard. So again, these are probably the easiest pieces to install. So the next piece that I want to show you guys is the RAM. So when you hear somebody talking about how much memory you've got or how much RAM you've got, that's what they're talking about, is how much RAM you've got. These are two sticks. I don't even know how big these are, but I think these are 8 gig. So the two of them, each one is 4. It equals 8. Typically, on most motherboards nowadays, you will find kits. They're called dual-channel kits. Sometimes you'll even find triple-channel kits. I'm not going to get into what that means exactly, but most of the time you will be buying your memory in pairs, or even triple. Again, it is impossible to install these incorrectly on the motherboard. The reason being is you'll notice that one side is longer than the other. There's also a notch there. Oops, excuse me. There's also a notch right there, almost in the middle, that would keep you from installing it incorrectly on the motherboard. What I'm trying to get through here to you guys is it's almost impossible to install anything incorrectly on a computer. So right there, you know, most people are worried, oh my god, I don't know how to install it, I'll put it in wrong. You can't. Unless you jam it in there and bust it off, you really cannot. So that's what the RAM looks like. It's very easy. You know, it'll just fit in the motherboard much like that. And again, once we get to the motherboard, I'll show you guys how that fits. The next piece I'm going to show you guys is the CPU. This tiny little guy right here, and also its heatsink counterpart. The heatsink, this just keeps the CPU cool. This is just a stock heatsink that actually came with this CPU. There's nothing special about it. It's not aftermarket, but it does its job. We'll go over this a little bit, but there's not much to it. It just pulls heat away, essentially. This is an Intel CPU. Most Intel CPUs nowadays, in fact, I think all Intel CPUs use what's called an LGA bottom here. So what that means is it stands for land grid array. You guys don't really need to know the specifics, but basically there's no longer any pins on the bottom of this. It's kind of nice so that you don't accidentally bend pins on the CPU. All of the pins are now on the motherboard. AMD chips do still use PGA, which are the pins. So if you're installing an AMD processor, you do still need to be careful about bending any of the pins on the bottom. So that's one advantage that I think Intel has over AMD. But you know, AMD can be cheaper too, so you know, you've just got to weigh the cost and all that good stuff. But this is the CPU. This is the brain. This does all of the processing. It's really difficult to see, but you can see model information on the top of it here. Very simple, you know, there's no moving parts. Again, exactly the same. You cannot install this incorrectly on the motherboard. It's very difficult to see, I'm not sure, but right here where my finger is, where I'm tapping, there's a little arrow. That will help you. On top of that, there are notches. There's a notch here, and then there's a notch here at the top as well to help you line it up when you're plugging it into the motherboard. So again, impossible to install it incorrectly. Unless you jam it in there. You'll typically put what I call thermal goop on the top of this. It helps heat transfer with the heatsink on the bottom here. If you're installing a fresh CPU with a brand new heatsink, chances are there's already you know, thermal stuff on the bottom. Sometimes you'll want to buy a third-party thermal goop because the transfer properties can be better. But again, that's, you know, more of an advanced topic that we're not necessarily going to go over. Basically, the CPU sits like this on the motherboard, the heatsink will go over the top of it and snap down. And that's why you never see the CPU, because you've got this giant heatsink sitting on top of it. If you don't have a giant heatsink, this thing will fry. So that's always important. So the next thing we're going to do is the video card. Again, this is probably the second easiest piece to install or upgrade. It's basically just plugging it into a slot. Let me take the protector off here. This is an older video card. Most of them are this size, maybe a little bit smaller when you're talking about gaming video cards. There are smaller video cards, one that I have here. This one's not necessarily meant for gaming, you know, and it doesn't have any bells or whistles. It is much smaller too. But most of the time you guys are going to be dealing with a monster of this size, maybe a little bit smaller. Again, this is an older one, but the size stays the same. Pretty much the only thing you need to worry about here is this connection here. Excuse me. This is the PCIe or PCI Express connection, PCI 16X. This is where it's going to plug into the motherboard, and again, we'll show that once I bring the motherboard out. The other important thing, though, is when you're dealing with gaming type video cards, they require their own power connectors. The motherboard doesn't have enough power to supply to them. This particular card requires a 6-pin and an 8-pin. Depending on the card, some of them are just a single 6-pin, some are 2 6-pins, and I've even seen 2 8-pins. Those will come off of your power supply. Here, I have one here. And it specifically says PCIe right here, so you know that this goes to the motherboard. This one is a 6-pin, but can be changed into an 8-pin with this tiny little piece here. So again, with the video card, the biggest thing you need to worry about is make sure that you're plugging it into the correct slot, which again, it is impossible to plug it in correctly. There's only going to be one, maybe two PCIe 16X connections on your motherboard, unless you've got a motherboard that has additional. Two is fairly standard for people who like to do SLI and Crossfire, though. Any more than two, it gets very complicated, so most of the time you'll just have two. The other thing you want to remember with your video card when you're buying one is just the monitor connections. Nowadays, everything is starting to go towards HDMI and DisplayPort. That's what these two are. These are mini DisplayPort connections here. The old DVI connections are still found and still used today. I use most of mine on my video cards. But when you're upgrading a video card or you're buying a video card, make sure you pay attention. You can't get an incorrect video card for your monitor, but you may need to buy an adapter. If your monitor doesn't have DVI connections on it and you want to use DVI connections, you'll need to get a HDMI to DVI adapter. Same thing with DisplayPort. You can get DVI to HDMI, so on and so forth. Again, it gets a little complicated, but we're not going to cover that in this video. So, there's the video card. The thing is huge. The thing is heavy. This top part is pretty much the heat sink, and under it is all of the components. I can't really show that, but right here would be what's called the GPU, very similar to the CPU. This is what makes your games work. And let's see here, we've got two more pieces. Let's go over let me get this cable out of the way. Let's go over the power supply. Again, this is an older power supply, but the connections are pretty much all the same. Now, this probably looks scary. It's a bundle of wires. Oh my god, what the hell do I do with this? Again, almost every single connection in here, probably every single connection, only fits one place on any given component. You cannot you can't plug in this great big huge 24 pin into a RAM slot. It's not going to happen. You can't plug this into an SATA slot. It's just not going to happen. They don't fit. So it makes it so much easier, so you guys don't have to worry about that. Pretty much with a standard, this is a standard power supply. You've got a switch here. Right now it's in the off position. That would be on. That's the biggest problem that I see when new people build their computer, is they forget to put the switch on. They'll put everything together and they'll push the power button on the front of the computer and nothing happens and they freak out. Make sure you always, when you're building your computer, make sure it is in the off position, the circle position. But when you're ready to power up your machine, just flip it on to the on position. A couple of different connections that we've got here. This monster right here, this is the main motherboard power connection. This is what powers the motherboard. There's a great big huge spot on the motherboard for it, which we'll show. This can be 20 to 24 pin, depending on the motherboard. Then we've got a CPU. This powers the CPU. Normally it's 4 pin, some are 8 pin, and you can only, if your motherboard is only 8 pin, this will still fit. You just have to look at the different pins. They are shaped differently, and you just line them up with the connection on the motherboard. Again, you can't do it wrong. It's very simple. It's kind of hard to see, I apologize, but there's the pins there. A lot of cables. Let's move them out of the way. Here again, this is that same connection that I showed earlier. It says right on it, PCIe. This is specifically for video cards. You don't use it for anything else. And again, it's got the little tail on it. If you need more than just 6 pins here, this little tail folds up, and it's, the cables can be a little stiff, but basically it just fits on the side here and turns it into an 8 pin. And it can be a little bit of a pain in the butt to plug in, but once you get it, you pretty much never have to touch it again until you upgrade your video card. This power supply has 2. Most power supplies you find today will have 2 of these because most gaming video cards require 2 because they suck so much power. Jumble. Move this out of the way. Here we have an SATA power connector. Typically these come bunched together in 2s like this, so that you've got 2 hard drives stacked. You can plug them in, like that. And then we should have the old school 4-pin connectors. These nowadays are actually used. These are called Molex connectors. These nowadays are actually used as adapters. If you don't have enough PCIe connections, you can actually get an adapter that will fit onto the Molex here. to give you additional if your power supply only had one. There's not very many components nowadays, aside from fans, that will use these old style connectors. These used to be the connectors that would power your hard drive, but hard drives have since gone to that SATA power standard. So it's kind of a legacy thing, but again, fans inside the case will plug into these on occasion, and you can get adapters for various things, most commonly for graphics card PCIe connectors. So that's it for the power supply. So the last piece that we've got here, making sure I'm not forgetting anything, I don't think so, pretty sure I've showed everything, is the motherboard. And this is where things get a little complicated. At least they look like they're getting complicated. There it is in all its glory. That's the body of your computer. This is where everything is going to plug into. Now this is an older motherboard. It's 2 generations behind. I believe this is an Ivy Bridge, not that that matters. But all of the connections remain the same. On this side here, this is what you guys see on the back of your computer. You know, when you look on the back of your computer, you see all the various connections. You've got your USB connections, you have your network connection, your sound, you know, plugging in your speakers and whatnot. So this is what you guys normally see. You guys probably rarely see all of this. I'm going to go over the important parts, and I will also probably be displaying a couple of pictures up on the screen as well for this video to help explain some of this stuff. Where I'd like to start is with the CPU. So right here is the CPU socket. Now again, this is an Intel-based motherboard. This is not AMD. AMD motherboards look exactly the same, but the socket is a little bit different because AMD has pins on the bottom of the CPU. So this will actually be what's called a ZIF socket, and they have a bunch of holes in them that you basically drop the CPU in. For Intel here, we'll go ahead and open this up here. This is the latch that will, you know, that unlocks what holds the CPU in place, and that just opens up. It's very hard to see on the video, but there are tons of tiny little pins. And like I said, this is what I consider the advantage of AMD, or excuse me, Intel, just because it's very difficult to bust these off. It's much easier to bust a pin off on the CPU itself, but since Intel doesn't have those pins, it just rests on top of them. So again, I mentioned that there's only one way to install this. Most motherboards, and this one, I'm not sure if we can see it here. Yes, we can kind of see it. You'll notice up here in the top corner there is a white dot. That white dot lines up with that arrow that I had shown you guys earlier that's in the corner there. The other thing is over here in the corners, and it's difficult again to see on the video, even if I get it up there, but there are tiny little notches, and I said there were notches on this CPU. So they all line up. Pretty much you just lay the CPU in there. Okay, and it literally just lays in there like that. All you have to do is close the top then and lock it down, and that's it, and it will lock down like that. Now once the CPU is locked down, you'll want to apply if you need to, you'll want to apply thermal goop that I was talking about earlier. Some people like to apply thermal goop to the CPU before you put it into the socket. In that case, you need to be very careful and only grab the CPU by its sides because you don't want to get that stuff all over your fingers. It also smears it around the CPU, and that's not a good thing. But once the CPU is actually mounted in there, if your heatsink, I'm going to close this up here real quick. If your heatsink already has thermal goop pre-applied, then basically you just need to mount the heatsink once you've put in the CPU. Heatsinks are probably one of the most difficult parts to mount, especially these stock ones are fairly easy. These mounting brackets are pretty easy to use, and I'll show you guys how they work. I don't have any aftermarket ones on hand, so I can't show that on video, but those can get a little tricky. There are lots of videos out there on how to install specific models of aftermarket heat sinks, though. So as long as you do your homework, watch the videos and read the directions, you shouldn't have too many problems. For this particular one, And this motherboard, I should say, some motherboards support certain heat sinks. There is not one heat sink that necessarily fits all. Sometimes the spacing is a little bit different, so you do need to do a little bit of research. But again, on this motherboard here, where is it? Right here, there's a hole here, there's one over here, and then there's two down there. Basically, this heatsink will sit on top of the CPU, and these stands here on each corner will fit in there. This particular one, what happens, turn it on, is this little clip fits into that hole, you push it forward and it will lock in. And it grabs onto the bottom of it and it's mounted, and that's it. Like I said, some aftermarkets get a little bit more complicated. You'll have things that fit in the holes that you actually have to screw down. Some of them have latches depending on the CPU type. Again, it's a little bit more for this video, but the heatsink, I do admit, is probably the hardest part of installing a computer. Just make sure you take your time, do your research, and you shouldn't have any problems. So we'll get that out of here. The next thing that I'll show is how to install the RAM. We'll go ahead and flip the motherboard around for this. The RAM slots are right here, and you'll notice that they are different colors. Earlier I had mentioned that most RAM that you buy will come in kits. Those are called dual channel kits. Some of them are triple channel, but most you'll find are dual channel. The reason for that is just speed. I won't get into a huge technical explanation of it, but basically you will take your RAM and you will install them into the two same colored slots. Most motherboards, it doesn't matter. You can pick blue or black in this case. Some of them are white and red. The colors don't matter. What matters is that there will be two slots that are exactly the same color. And you want to make sure that you fit your RAM into those matching slots. So in this one, I had it in the blue ones. You can see because I have the releases down. And if you look closely again, you'll notice again, there's a short side and a long side with that notch here in the middle. So it is literally, like I mentioned, impossible to install this incorrectly. That short side, while the short side's going to fit into the long side certainly won't fit into the short side. And that notch will keep you from, jamming the RAM in there. So basically what we do, we line it up. So I've got the short side here, long side here. Both sides fit in. There's a little guide on the side. It slides down. Now the RAM can be a little difficult. It feels like you're going to break it when you're putting pressure. You do need to put some pressure on it. You will hear that snap, and that one didn't really snap, but the releases on the sides here, I don't know if I can show it here. So here's a release. That is in the locked position. So this is now in the locked position, and this piece of RAM has been installed. These releases are what you would use to remove the RAM if you need to. You basically just apply pressure, and it pops it out. So this side is now popped out. Don't pull it out just yet, though. You need to make sure that you release the other side here. So we'll go ahead and do that. There. So both sides are released. Pull the RAM straight out, which it's a little tight. Here we go. Very easy to install. Again, it's a little tight, and if this is the first time you're doing it, it might feel like, oh my god, I'm going to break it. But as long as you're careful and you apply just enough pressure equally on both sides, it fits in no problem. Very easy to install. It's much easier to install when the motherboard is not mounted in the case. If the motherboard is mounted in the case, it's pretty much the same thing. It's just you don't have as much room to work in. So we'll go ahead and remove this. Get that out of there. And again, you would put the two pieces, I've got the two here, either in both blues or both black. The next thing we're going to talk about is the SATA connections. These are where your motherboard, this is where your hard drives and also your hard drives, SSDs, and your CD-ROM or Blu-ray will connect. In this particular case, the SATA connectors are pointing up. Some motherboards have them pointing, straight out this way, so your cable would actually come out the side here instead of straight off. But again, these have the exact same notches. The white one is much easier to see than the black one. And actually, you can now see that notch that I was talking about. These on the motherboard have the exact same notch, that you have on the hard drives and the CD-ROM. So again, it is literally impossible unless you force it and snap it in there to install it incorrectly. And as far as the cables go, the cables are interchangeable. It doesn't matter what side goes where. This particular cable, though, is built with a 90-degree angle. I don't know if I can... There, we can see that. The reason for this is it's much easier to plug in, given how hard drives are mounted in the case, it's much easier to plug it in at a 90-degree angle. So in this particular case, you would use this side for the hard drive and this side for the motherboard. But if you get cables that have two straight connections like this, it doesn't matter what side goes where. They're interchangeable, you know, you can flip-flop them, it doesn't matter. Again, line up the notch, it plugs right in, you hear it click. In this case, this one has, you know, a clip that keeps it from, you know, being pulled out, and that's it. Plug it into your hard drive or whatever, you know, whatever device, your SSD, and you're off and running. Remove that. This motherboard has 6 SATA connections. So basically I can plug in 6 hard drives, or I can plug in 5 hard drives and 1, you know, Blu-ray. I can plug in 4 hard drives, 1 SSD. You know, the combination doesn't matter. Different motherboards and different motherboard brands will have different amounts of SATA ports. Some only have 4. You can get some that have 12 if you need that many. I think my gaming computers have, I believe, 10 each. So, because I like to put a lot of hard drives into my computers. So, they're the SATA ports. They are located in different spots on different motherboards, but they're very easy to spot. I mean, that's the only connection you can use to plug in hard drives. I won't get into some of the the SSDs that actually connect to the motherboard. We won't get into that. The last part, before I go over the different power connections, would be the PCI, excuse me, the PCIe slots. We have a couple of different here. Let's see if I can get that better. All right. So this tiny one here is what's called a 1X. The larger one that's next to it is a 16X. This is the one that you're going to plug your your video card into. This particular motherboard has 2 1X slots. We have 2 here. This is an old style PCI 32-bit connection. These are actually starting to go away. Like I said, this is an older motherboard. I am still seeing quite a few motherboards with 1 of these left for legacy support, but I'm guessing within the next 5 years you will no longer see a PCIe, or excuse me, just a standard PCI connection any longer. And here we have another 16. Now, during the showing of this, I have a picture up on the side that, you know, you can see it a little bit better. It will also show that there are additional ports. They're not used very often, but there is, along with the 1X, there is a 4X that your motherboard could potentially have if you buy a motherboard with it. There are connections called 8X as well. If I remember correctly, 8X is the same size as the 16X. I would have to check. But when you're installing when you're installing a video card, you always want to use the topmost, and this is the top here. The port that's closest to the outside here is considered the top PCI port. This is the port that you would use for your video card. Reason being is this has the most bandwidth out of all of them. Again, it gets very complicated, and I'm not going to go over it. Suffice it to say, when you install more than one video card, typically this will knock these down to running at 8x speeds. But again, I'm not going to get too much into that. Just know that if you're building a brand new build and you've got one video card, you want to install in the top slot. It's very easy to install. It literally slides in there. Again, you can't install it incorrectly. You'll notice that this won't fit into any other slot. I mean, I literally cannot fit that into a 1X slot. That's just way too big. So this might be a little difficult to show because the motherboard was laying on the ground, and this actually, you know, it rests a little bit higher, but you basically just slide it on in. It's very difficult to show. I apologize. I don't know if I can. Yeah, that's not going to work. But I'm going to slide it in, and you'll hear a snap, and that's it. It's installed now. Now, if this were in a case, I would be mounting these two pieces to the case so that the card can't rock, because these cards are very heavy and you could potentially snap the PCIe connection right off the board. So first of all, you won't mount a video card until this is in the case. You can mount the RAM and you can mount the CPU, but do not mount a video card before you've mounted the case, or excuse me, before you've mounted the motherboard in the case. It just won't work. Most of these have quick releases so that the card can't be pulled out. Be very careful here because, again, I don't want to snap the case off, or the port off. Make sure I support its weight. I don't know if you can see it in there, and it's very difficult for me to, let's rest it. It's over here. There's a quick release in here. You cannot pull the video card out without using that quick release, and every motherboard is a little bit different. Some of them is a button, some of them is just a lever that you move out of the side. So I always recommend, when doing a new build, familiarize yourself with the motherboard, you know, all of its different components before you install anything. That way, if you have to work on it further down the line, you know exactly how things release. This one is lucky, it's just a push. I just push it down, and the video card should pop right out, and there it goes. Alright, so the last thing that I want to do with this video, we've gone over pretty much everything, is I just want to show you guys the various power connections. You know, there's a lot of pins on these motherboards, some things that you will use, some things that you won't use, and all of it can look a little intimidating, but it's all pretty easy. You take a look up here. This is that main 24-pin power connection that I was talking about. That's that massive power connection for the power supply. Again, these pins are shaped in such a way that you can only plug it in one way. So you can't accidentally plug it in incorrectly. The other way that you can tell that you're plugging it in correctly, and because it's a black plastic, I don't know if it's going to be able to be seen, but right there's a tiny little notch where my finger is. That notch matches up with, yeah, again, it's there we go, this clip here. This clip is what keeps this power connector in place, and you know, you can't just rip it out. So again, that's another way you can tell that you're installing it correctly. If this clip is going to latch on to that little clip, you're golden. The other one that I want to show, the two most important would be the main power, and then over here is the CPU connection. This is that 8-pin that I was showing earlier. Let's see, where is it? There it is. So this is that 8-pin one. Again, it has that same clip right here, so you know you're lining it up correctly. You also know you're lining it up correctly because, again, these pins are shaped in such a way that you can't accidentally plug it in incorrectly. Different motherboards will have this connection in different locations. Same thing with this. So, I mean, if you're using this video as a basis for building your computer, this port could be shoved further down here, you know, it could be shoved sideways. It just depends on the motherboard configuration. Everyone does it a little bit different. Just take some time. Your motherboard manual will show you where everything is. So there we go. There's the main power connection, 24-pin, the CPU connection. Some are 8, some are 4, some are 6. It just depends. Some other connections on here that can be important is right here. We have this little white, and it's 3-pin. Very difficult to see because it's so tiny, but there's 3 pins here. It's also difficult to read what it says, but this one is called system fan. This would be a spot that you could plug in a fan that's installed in the case. There's also one on here, and I should have looked before I started talking. There it is. This one right here, and you guys might be able to read it, but it says CPU fan. This is where you want to plug in your heatsink. Your heatsink will always come with, you know, a connection similar to this. Some of them might use that 4-pin Molex connector I was talking about. That's kind of rare, and the reason for that is because by using a power connector on the motherboard can actually monitor the RPM of the fan. So, and you can set up, you know, system alerts if for some reason the fan drops below, say, 500 RPM. You could set your system to alert you. You know something's up with the fan, maybe it's dying. So 9 times out of 10, on your heatsink, you're going to use the connector that's on the motherboard. Now you want to make sure that you find the one that specifically says CPU. Otherwise, it's not going to monitor it properly. In this case, this one is a 4-pin. Some of them are 3-pin. And most motherboards can be plugged in. This one does have 4 pins on it, but it will support 3-pin. So I don't think I've ever run into a motherboard that didn't support both. You shouldn't have any trouble with that. There are a couple of these on there. This one, every motherboard's a little bit different, but this one, just a quick look at it, it looks like it has spots for 1 CPU fan, which makes sense, and then 2 system fans. There's one here and one here. The last part of the motherboard that I think I want to show you guys is, oh, you know what? There were 2 more system fans up here. My bad. Alright. So the last part that I want to show you guys on the motherboard is down here at the bottom. This is the bottom of the motherboard, typically the very last port, and then below that is the bottom of the motherboard. This is typically where you'll see a ton of pins here, and it can get very confusing. Oh my god, what do they do? Most of them are for additional USB ports. So if your case comes with front-facing USB ports, or maybe you have USB ports on the top, your case will have a plug that will plug into these. I don't know if you can see it. Yeah, you can kind of see it there. That one says USB. So does this one. These 2 would be for, case USB. They could also be used for an add-on card that would plug into the back of your, that would, go into the back of your computer. Some of these, let's see, this one here is for USB 3. If your case supports USB 3, it's a little bit different. There's more pins to it because USB 3 is faster. It has more wires to it, so there's more pins here. Again, the motherboard manual will show you everything, and I'll try and put some pictures up on the screen for that. The last one that's kind of a pain in the butt, and arguably the second hardest part of installing a computer, the heatsink being the first. The second part is down here, and again, they're very difficult to see, and they could be in a slightly different location depending on the motherboard, but these are used for connecting all of the various case connections. Your power button, your reset switch, even the hard drive activity lights. That's what these pins are for. And do I have, let's see if I can bring this on screen here. Move this out of the way. I do have a case sitting next to me. It's very heavy. I didn't think about this before I started making the video, so we're just winging it at this point. Alright. We'll bring that in here. Let's see if it's long enough. Of course it's not. You can kind of see it. I apologize, guys. Let's pull that out. So there's a lot of different connections here, and yeah, that doesn't show up very well. I apologize. But there's quite a few different connections. They're all 2-pin. Sometimes they're 3-pin, depending on the case. But they're all labeled. If you look at them very closely, they will say, like this one here is for the hard drive activity light. Your motherboard manual will tell you exactly where that needs to plug in. Every motherboard is a little bit different in how the pins from the case plug in. So you will have to refer to your motherboard manual. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to scoot this over here, and over here I'm going to go ahead and pop up a picture of the manual for this particular motherboard, and it's going to show you what I'm talking about. It'll show you where the hard drive activity light plugs in. It'll show you where the speaker plugs in, which is right here. It'll show you where the power switch plugs in and where the reset switch plugs in. They're a pain in the butt because they cannot be done while this is outside of the case. This is another piece that you're going to want to make sure that this is mounted into the case before you try to plug these in, because most of them are not long enough. You'll notice mine don't go very far. Mostly it's because of how I have it routed, but even so, if I didn't have these routed, in the back of the case, they would only come out to about here. So the cables are not very long. But these are very important because without plugging these in correctly, you're not going to hurt anything, but when you push the power button, your computer's not going to turn on. If you accidentally plug in the power switch to the hard drive activity light, nothing's going to happen. So these can be a pain in the butt to get correct the first time. I know when I first started to learn how to build computers, it took me a couple of times before I started doing it right every time. But again, if you just refer to your motherboard manual that comes with your motherboard, it's got a wealth of information. and the pictures in most of them are great. That's what I go off of nowadays. I just go off the picture. Why read? There's no reason to read it. Just go off the picture. So that's pretty much it. That is all of the basic components of a computer. I guess the one last thing, I apologize, that I do want to show here, I'm not going to show actually mounting this into the case. It's pretty easy, but the one thing that you guys need to make sure is you locate all of the different holes on the motherboard. Let's see, there's one here. These are the holes that you will use, there's one here, to mount this to the case. Not necessarily, all of the holes will not necessarily be used. Sometimes certain cases will only have certain stands. So it might not have, you know, this one in the middle here, but it will have the one over here, and it'll have the one over here and up here. You just need to take a look beforehand, do a little planning. That way you know exactly how many screws you need to mount this to the case. So that's pretty much it. Pretty basic, but again, the thing that I want to stress the most is, you know, this is pretty intimidating. It looks very intimidating, but again, you cannot plug anything in incorrectly. You know, the SATA ports, they've got a notch on them so that you can't plug it in wrong. The RAM slots, one side is going to be shorter than the other, and then they also have the little notch in the middle. So again, you cannot plug it in incorrectly. The CPU socket here, the same way. This won't close properly if you don't have the CPU installed correctly. And also it has the two notches on the side to help line it up. The power connectors here and here, same thing, you cannot plug them in incorrectly. You can't put your video card in backwards because, you know, if those ports for the video card aren't coming out the back of your case, that's the wrong way to do it. So again, I just want to show you guys, it's very simple. I'm not going over any advanced troubleshooting or anything like that, but I want people to get over their anxiety that, oh, I can't upgrade a video card, or I can't upgrade a hard drive, or I can't build an entire computer. There's lots of resources out there on the internet. You know, the motherboard manufacturers will have lots of resources on, you know, all of the different components of your motherboard, how everything fits onto it. And there's tons of us out there, myself included, who are more than happy to answer questions if you have them. You know, if you are doing a new build and you have some questions on, you know, something, make sure you give, you know, people like myself and whoever else you might be asking for help, information. We might need things like the motherboard model, which you can see right here. That way we can pull up a picture of your motherboard and we can help you, you know, locate something if you can't find a particular pin. You know, knowing those kinds of details definitely helps us, you know, help troubleshoot you guys. You know, if you just come to us and say, well, I can't plug this into my motherboard, help me. You know, I need to know what the motherboard is and what you're trying to plug in and all that good stuff. So, very easy to do. That's pretty much it for my video. I hope you guys found it useful. If anyone has anything, any questions, I'm more than happy to answer anything. You guys can go ahead and toss questions in the comments. Most of you know how to reach me via Twitch because I stream daily. So yeah, that's it, guys. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you guys do take the initiative and, you know, do your own upgrade or build your own computer, because it can actually be very rewarding when you do it. So thank you guys for watching. I appreciate it, and I will talk to you guys soon.